Without much further ado, he's really a very well-known, brilliant historian. Over to Phil.
Thanks, Olga. Hi there, it's very nice to see you all here today. So my own apologies for the weather. This time last year it was all shorts and sandals. It's freezing today. But as Olga said, my name is Phil Withington. I'm a professor in British history, as you can see. And I work primarily on the 16th and 17th centuries. These are some publications just to prove that I am a real historian. That was the first book I covered. It's the most recent. You can see over the decades, the pictures have got bigger, a bit like my waistline, which is a bit worrying. But Intoxication in Society was the last one that came out just before Christmas. Now, I moved to Sheffield from Cambridge last year, so I'm actually quite new myself. And the reason I came up here, one of the reasons, is that within the history profession, Sheffield is known to be one of the best research and teaching departments in the country, and as a historian, it really is a great place to work. And I haven't been disappointed in my decision to come here, and I can assure you that in lots of ways the education in history that you get here is quite as good, if not in certain respects better, than Cambridge, where I worked for 2 years. Now I'm happy to sort of talk about why I think that in questions, but what I've been asked to do today is to talk for 15 minutes or so about my special subject, which has been running this year, and what you would be doing if you decided to take it when you came to Sheffield in 3 years' time. You've heard a little bit, I imagine, about the special subject, and I know one of the students just mentioned it then. It is an unusual course within the programme in that it's the kind of climax, the conclusion to your degree, and there's certain bits about it which are very special. It runs for both semesters over the year rather than just for one. Its numbers are capped at 16, so the classes are nice and small, and it's taught purely by seminars, so there's lots of discussion. You have 2 2-hour seminars a week, and it involves a lot of primary source material. And it really does give you the opportunity to go into a level of detail and scrutiny that you really don't get in other kinds of courses. And I can assure you, having taught the same kind of course in Cambridge, the equivalent course, it's quite as intense and as satisfying an experience here as it is there. Now, my special subject is called Renaissance and Popular Culture in early modern England, and it's actually designed as a way for me to share and discuss ideas and research which I'm doing for a book on the same subject. So for me there's a very close relationship between the teaching of the course and the writing of the book, and I've had a lot of good input from the students, and of course I will accredit them if the book's ever published. And it's predicated, the course invites the student to address a common but I think misleading assumption about England and the rest of Britain in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's an assumption which I think is held both by historians of the period, my colleagues, and the reading public more generally. And there's 2 parts of this assumption which the course is is addressing or inviting the students' critique. And the first of these is that the Renaissance happened in Italy, the Low Countries, France, parts of Central Europe, but not properly in England, Scotland or Ireland, that it comes somehow passed us by, this Renaissance. And the second is that in Renaissance England, those who did participate in it or were affected by it were only a tiny social and economic elite, not the ordinary people, or what historians also call popular culture. Now, there's a bigger underlying assumption, I think, underpinning those 2 assumptions, which we're also concerned with. And this is the assumption that the Renaissance, or the rebirth, or the rediscovery of ancient Greece and Rome, is actually a rediscovery of the art and architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. And that it involved the attempts by Europeans to match that, those achievements in art and architecture, and perhaps supersede them in their own culture. So this a kind of conflation of the Renaissance with art and architecture makes us think, I suppose, of the Renaissance in these terms. Here you have, obviously, Michelangelo and Da Vinci, their great works of art. You have Da Vinci's scientific doodlings and so on. You have Vermeer in the Low Countries, his beautiful portraits and realism. In England, all you get really is a few painters who hung around the courts of monarchs and a few aristocrats. This is Holbein the Younger, his portrait of Thomas More, and of course Holbein isn't even English. And the general conclusion that people reach is that we don't have this kind of artistic and architectural achievement until the 18th century, in the neoclassical period. And that is itself the product of a very different set of economic and cultural circumstances. What we have instead in the 16th and 17th centuries, this is still going with this assumption that the course is kind of set against, is that in England, Scotland and Ireland, we don't have the Renaissance, but we have the Reformation, which is the break with Rome and the establishment of a Protestant ascendancy. And it's counter-Reformation in Ireland in particular. And it's religion which is the dominant cultural force of the period. And here we have the Marian martyrs. We have two Puritans who go to America. We have Oliver Cromwell and the English Revolution. Okay. So my special subject in kind of taking on these assumptions allows students to revisit those assumptions about Renaissance as continental and elite, and reconsider whether the Renaissance had an impact on English popular culture. And it's not an unreasonable thought you might be having now is, how does it do this? And the first and most important place to start, I think, and what we do in the course, is to rethink what we, and much more importantly, what contemporaries living in the 16th centuries actually mean by Renaissance. Okay? It's not simply the rebirth of classical art and architecture. It's a much more extensive and encompassing process than that. Okay? If we start to think about how contemporaries understood the ancients and the relationship of the ancients to the present, then we find that the mindset was to take the whole of classical culture, recover it and relearn it for the benefit of their contemporary societies. Okay, so it's a bit of a distortion, thanks to, I suppose, the attractiveness of the images in lots of ways, that we have this kind of automatic assumption that it involves Michelangelo, Da Vinci and Vermeer and so on. But what we have instead is a contemporary obsession, in fact, with the ancients in terms of their literatures and their languages, the Greek and the Roman, the philosophies of these cultures, the codes of manners and civility, attitudes to education, we're going to come back to that, law and citizenship, very important, ideas about families and what it is to be a man and a woman, poetry and theatre, medicine, knowledge systems like astrology, even jokes and drinking games. Okay, contemporaries obsessed with the ancients and these aspects of Greek and Roman culture. And in fact, one of the particular areas that I'm interested in getting the students to think about and making them aware of is a phenomenon called Renaissance humanism, which from the 13th, 14th century initially spread across the Alps into Northern Europe, eventually into England in the 16th century. And these humanists prioritized interest in the literary, in the linguistic, in the legal, the political, and most importantly, all the educational lessons that the ancients could teach contemporary societies. And these men, they're usually men, and they become women a bit later, become prominent advocates of educational and political reform across southern and northern Europe, including England. Okay, what has that got to do with English popular culture, you might ask? Well, humanism becomes the basis of reforming agendas and improvement agendas within contemporary societies through education, through law, through language, and thanks to technological innovations, through popular print. Okay? And what we find is the translation of Greek and Latin into the vernacular languages, such as English, French, and Dutch. And so vernacular cultures are reformed in order to try and transcend their classical forefathers. And whereas the art and the architecture doesn't take root in England, and it's a very good question, and one that hasn't been answered, why that's the case necessarily. What does take root are all these different kinds of Renaissance, which usually pass under the historian's radar. The literary Renaissance, the medical Renaissance, the educational Renaissance, astrological, in manners, the political Renaissance. This is the era of the birth of the nation. And nationalism, don't believe your teachers if they tell you it's a 19th century phenomenon, and so on. Okay, so this Renaissance, in a much wider and encompassing sense, is a real factor, a real feature of the cultural, political, social and economic life of England from around the beginning of the 16th century through to the 17th. Now, I'm going to give you, got a few minutes, I'll give you a few examples of how this is taking place and the areas which the students have looked at, particularly in the first semester. In the second semester, in the first semester we look at how this Renaissance is institutionalised in various ways. In the second, we look at the more direct impact on the experience of individual men and women. But one of the examples we look at is the educational Renaissance. These are just some statistics to show you the superficial way in which things have changed, and then obviously we delve into that a bit deeper. But in 1507, you can see that 90% of men and 99% of women were illiterate as we understand it. They couldn't, or are seen to have been unable to write and possibly read. By 1715, those figures have literally dropped to 55% among men and 75% among women. In a sample of 10 southeast counties, in 1606, in 1418 there were 34 types of secondary school, 410 by 1606. And perhaps most startlingly, the proportion of young men in further education in the 1630s, which might be understood as the height of this whole process, which is at the two universities, Oxford and Cambridge, and the London's are called, not matched again until the First World War, and not superseded until after 1945. Okay, so this educational revolution, as it's been described, is a real feature of the 16th and 17th centuries. In law as well, from 1560 through to the middle of the 17th century, basically England becomes a more litigious society in the sense that more people, ordinary people, use the law and the law courts, that's litigious, than the contemporary United States of America. And if anybody knows anything about the United States of America, you'll know that it's an extremely litigious society. And you have there the proportion of people in 1606 using it as measured by 100,000 of the population, 1,351. That compares to only 560 in 1975. This was an astonishingly legalistic age, the most legalistic age in English history. Perhaps more familiarly, we have the emergence of the culture industry and the emergence of modern English, the language of English. You have thousands of Latin and consonantal words translated into English. Some of my favourites, which I've studied myself: modern, society, civility. These are Latin terms coming into the vernacular. You have the standardisation of English vernacular. As across Europe, you have the standardisation of their vernaculars. This is this emergence of modern languages. But of course, you also have the cultural. This is a silly graph which shows the amount of printed literature per head of population as a silly line over the period. Basically, it goes up very steeply. You can see that. And this reflects the amount of popular literature that was available to contemporaries at this time. Okay, so we could go on. I could go on and on and on and on. I'm not going to. I may ask you a question. This is a question that we do ask in class on one of the days. Could William Shakespeare have written the plays and poems he did 100 years earlier than he did, say, between 1489 and 1516, rather than 1564 and 1616? And this is William Shakespeare. This was the Shakespeare who, I'm sure lots of you know, he was born into a Warwickshire glover's family, very humble. His father couldn't sign his name. but he was educated in Stratford-upon-Avon at the grammar school, the Free Grammar School. He went to London, joined a company of players called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, subsequently King's Men, who wrote his plays in collaboration. And these plays were drawn primarily from classical texts, from Plutarch, from North, from Holinshed. He made his fortune, he retired back to Warwickshire. What does Shakespeare's educational and career tell us? King Edward, the school he went to, was founded in 1553, part of this educational revolution I just mentioned. The curriculum was humanist, Renaissance humanist, in the way that I just talked about, and standardised by law. So Shakespeare learned classics and rhetoric as well as English reading and writing skills. This is just the glover's son from Stratford-upon-Avon. He joined the professional theatre companies which had begun to be formed from the 1570s as part of this cultural industry. Okay, the sources he used, they're all either translations or they're modelled on Roman and Greek equivalents. Okay, and he shows us, Shakespeare shows us, he's not a unique freak or genius in a kind of weird way, he's very much the product of his time. Okay, he's a product of the proliferation of schools and the further education, of the humanist curriculum, of this desire to translate into classical learning, of the professional theatre and culture industry, and all of those kinds of things. And his plays, of course, were played to not simply courts and elites, but to ordinary people on a daily basis. More people proportion watched and went to the theatre in London. Well, as many did, as they would perhaps watch EastEnders or Coronation Street today, if that's what people watch. Okay, so Shakespeare is like the living embodiment, if you like, of the English Renaissance, which is what we study in the course. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Richard.